So it's December 1st, and you're sitting around proud of yourself that you finished NaNoWriMo. You've got yourself a manuscript. Now what are you going to do? Query your dream agent? Get a multi-million-dollar book contract? Become super fabulous and wealthy? Star of your own television talk show? No. It's time to query. The first thing you're going to want to do is get over yourself. NaNoWriMo is just the start, followed by 6 to 12 months, maybe more, of revisions. The last thing you want to do is not be sure or be serious about what you're doing in a query letter. So before we even get to talking about specifically what goes into a query letter, you need to make sure that you've revised your manuscript to the point of it being perfect. Because with so many manuscripts hitting agents and editors' desks, you don't want to give them a reason to toss yours in the trash. And believe me, that happens probably 99% of the time. Typos, doublets, boring openings, info dumps, trash can. It's not the job of an agent or editor to produce a really engaging opening sentence, paragraph, chapter. That's really your responsibility. And if you don't have that yet, then you're probably not ready to write a query letter. What you need to do is get some critique on your work. And that's something that I really recommend before even writing a query letter, is that you get someone who can take an objective look at your work and give you a critique that's helpful. You can get this from online critique groups that meet in person. I have one that I meet with every week, and we just go over stuff, and they point out all of my crappy writing. You know who's really bad at critiques? Your friends and family. Grandma thinks everything you do is perfect and that you shoot rainbows out of your asshole. You don't. That's poop. The good news is, yes. The bad news is, it's time to get a divorce. A divorce from your manuscript. It's really difficult to sell anything when you're emotionally attached to it. And so the further you can distance yourself from it and look at it from the viewpoint of a salesperson versus the viewpoint of a writer, the better your query letter is going to be. Let's talk a little bit about construction. Basically, a query letter does three things. It introduces you as a writer, your book, and your credentials, if that's necessary. And for the most part, it kind of is. So let's talk about the introduction a little bit. You're going to want to do more than just talk about yourself in this section. You're going to want to talk about how it is that you came across the agent's name, the publishing house's name, and how you know specifically that they represent your genre that you're writing in. Whether it's YA, horror, urban fantasy, lit fic, nonfiction, I don't know, whatever it is you're writing in. And you're going to have to say that right up front. And for God's sake, spell their name right. You should never send out blanket queries that are like, Dear Editor, or Dear Agent, and expect them to feel like they've been personally contacted. There's nothing personal about a chain letter, and there's certainly nothing personal about a letter marked to a specific type of person. Do your research. Go to agentquery.com and search for the genre you're writing in, then do more research from there. Who does that agent represent? What books do those editors actually have out on the shelves? Mention that in your introduction. You know, I noticed that you represent Carrie Ryan. She's awesome. I'm also awesome. You probably don't want to say that. You might. It depends on the tone of your book. And once you've made that initial connection, you can go ahead and tell them who you are. This is the point where you can be really genuine and honest and say that you've been writing for this long and that it's really kind of your heart's desire to be published, and which sounds like, you know, it sounds like what everyone's going to say. It doesn't matter as long as you're being genuine. Okay, now the hard part. I got to put my glasses on for this shit. When you're talking about your book, your instincts will tell you that every part of it that's interesting to you is interesting to someone else. This is not the case. What the agent or editor is primarily looking for in this section of your query letter is to know whether or not you can tell a story in as brief and concise a way as possible, while maintaining the exciting quality of the story. So that's not easy. You're going to want to bare bones it. And the way I look at it, when I go through and think of my story, I make a list of all the things that are important about the novel. And make sure that they're in order, and go from there. The next thing I do is get rid of all of the extraneous stuff. If there are scenes that involve characters that are not your protagonist, your antagonist, possibly a mentor or love interest, I would probably not talk about it in your synopsis. Now, while you're narrowing stuff down, you want to keep in mind that your goal really is to show the agent or editor that you know about story arcs and how they work and how they function. So you're going to want to include certain sort of milestone moments in story, like a precipitating event, a bullet that kind of shoots your story in a direction and leads it eventually to a climax. Whatever that moment is in your book, you're going to talk about that. I wouldn't talk about it in a paragraph or two. Give it a sentence. You should be able to narrow things down within a sentence. Then go through and point out some key conflicts that happen. Key set pieces, things that are particularly interesting and set your book apart from other stories. Highlight the turns and definitely include the climax. Do not use your query letter as a means to titillate the editor or agent. And the tension builds to a climax so monumental, you'll be begging to read the partial. A partial means like several chapters of the opening of the book, in sequence, starting with chapter 1. And no, they won't. They won't be begging for it. If you don't give them the climax, they're not gonna ask to read anything of yours. That's just how it works. People tend to get full of themselves. Please rewind to the beginning of this video. They tend to get full of themselves and believe that they've written something so unique and interesting and completely original that the editor or agent will be shocked by the ending. And the truth is that most editors and agents are completely engrossed and enmeshed inside the storytelling world that they can pretty much pick out everything that's going to happen the second before it happens. It's just like part of how they kind of live and breathe it. So let's just tell them the story and leave all the other crap out of it. Let them sell it. I've mentioned tone before, and I think this is a good thing to keep in mind when you're writing your synopsis. You don't want to write a sort of a comedically toned synopsis for a very dramatic book, or vice versa. You know, it should match the tone. If you've got a very light-hearted book, your synopsis should be pretty light-hearted. Make sure that the tones match up. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same exact voice, but that would help. But it should be similar. So in the last part of the query letter, you're going to want to do some convincing. This is particularly true if you're writing a nonfiction book, wherein you'd have to describe your credentials, like I'm writing a book on self-help because I'm a psychotherapist. One of those kind of things. But fiction writers have credentials too, in the sense that they belong to certain organizations. I mean, if you're a member of SFWA, or the Romance Writers of America, or the Thriller Writers, or whatever writers, some sort of local chapter of something, you want to include that. If you've been with a online writing group or an in-person writing group, you want to include that you've been doing that. Describe your process a little bit. Have you had your book critiqued? Is it, do you feel like it's been through lots of revisions? This is probably not the point where you're going to say, I just finished my first draft of NaNoWriMo and here it is. That's trash bin. That's going to be trash bin. That's not to say that NaNoWriMo books don't become fabulous books that are sold in bookstores, because they do. I know lots of people that their first book was their NaNoWriMo book. No big deal. But you don't want to mention the fact that that you think so highly of yourself that your first draft is what you're going to give them to read, because they're not in the business of reading people's mess. They need revised stuff, grammatically correct stuff, and no spelling errors. While we're on the subject of that, because this is going to be the last thing I tell you, is that you should really spell check and grammar check your query letter and make sure that it doesn't have any stupid mistakes in it. That's it. Was the query letter video helpful? I don't know. I just talk. If you guys have questions about query letters, you can certainly leave them in the comments and I will respond as usual with typing and stuff. That's it.